Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to continue on with our urinary and excretory system here, or urinary system or excretory system, whichever one you want to call it is fair game. We finished off at around the nephron last time, and today we're going to talk about the functional unit of the kidney called the nephron. This is going to be what's doing all the filtration in your body. You have about a million of them inside, about half of them in one of your kidneys, half in the other kidney. Every single one of these 1 million nephrons has its own blood supply, which comes from the renal artery. And that comes into a special cluster of capillaries. Because there's a cluster of capillaries, there's a really high pressure in that blood network. We call this cluster a glomerulus. Now, because you have this high hydrostatic blood pressure, it's going to help us bring filtrate into the actual nephron to begin the filtration process. But let's try to understand the nephron a little bit better before we can get into those different parts. So here's an image of the kidney here on the left-hand side. You can see the outer region is called the renal cortex. The inner region is called the medulla. And if we zoom in on this clustery, zigzaggy pattern here inside of the medulla, you'll see it looks kind of like the intestines that we had in our digestive system. And that's because they are pretty much the same kind of thing. They're built for absorption. Now, to understand each part, we're going to look at every single individual section of one of these nephrons. So I'm going to bring my picture just over here because it's otherwise going to get in the way and understand every individual portion. I'll go through each of those portions with an image shortly. We're going to start off with the glomerular capsule. We can also call it Bowman's capsule because glomerular capsule is kind of tough to say. This is going to wrap itself around the glomerulus, and this is where the filtrate first enters into the nephron. This is followed by the PCT, which stands for the proximal convoluted tubule. In here, most of your absorption is going to happen. There's lots of microvilli here to increase surface area, so you get plenty of that absorption. Afterwards, we dip into this U-shaped tube called the loop of Henle, most of which are going to be short loops, but in some of your nephrons are going to be long as well. Loop of Henle starts off with a very narrow tube, and then it becomes a slightly wider tube to maximize that filtration. But we're going to understand that a bit more when we talk about the concentration gradients. Loop of Henle, once it comes back up and around, it combines into the DCT, which is a distal convoluted tubule. In here, any leftover reabsorption is going to happen, but not through a capillary network. These are next to these large cube-shaped, these square-shaped cells. So there's some cell-to-cell transfer here. And lastly, everything is going to empty into what's called your collecting duct. The collecting duct is going to take all of those filtrates that didn't end up being reabsorbed, and the collecting ducts will collect into your ureters, which eventually go into your bladder. So here's a picture of what everything looks like. We start off with this renal artery. This renal artery clusters in the glomerulus in this little network over here. The artery that brings the blood to the glomerulus is called the afferent arteriole. Arteriole because it's a very thin and small artery. Afferent, A is the first letter of the alphabet. So before the glomerulus, you get the afferent arteriole. After the glomerulus, you get the efferent arteriole with an E. The difference is the afferent has all the filter. It's got all the salts, all the sugars, all the stuff that needs to be filtered out. That is going to enter the nephron. The efferent arteriole is mostly just blood cells and blood plasma, but it forms this pertubular network around the nephron. So that allows it to have this high sense of reabsorption. It comes back into the bloodstream in this capillary network. Meanwhile, the oxygen is dumped off into the kidneys from this pertubular network, and then they're reconnected at the renal vein, which is this big blue vein on the side here. This cluster, as mentioned before, is purple. You're going to get uh, both oxygenated and deoxygenated blood here. This is your capillary network at the PCT and the glomerulus. This is the Bowman's capsule surrounding it, and then you have the PCT, which is this backwards S-shaped structure at the top of the nephron. Then we enter the loop of Henle. You can see it thins out near the bottom, and it thickens out again at the right side. The left side we call the descending limb. The right side we call the ascending limb. And then we enter the DCT, which is this S-shaped pattern on the end of the nephron. Lastly, the DCT is going to connect to the collecting duct at the very end. The collecting duct has all these spouts, which are connecting from other nephrons. These are collecting into the renal pelvis and then into the ureters themselves. You can see that the inner part of your kidneys are called the renal medulla. It's a very salty region. We'll talk about that shortly. And the outer region is called your renal cortex. If you recall from our first unit, cortex is the outer portion of some sort of organ or body tissue. The medulla is the inner portion of that tissue. Now, in terms of what is filtered, all of your water, nitrogenous waste, various salt ions are going to be filtered. You will never find blood or plasma proteins or blood plasma. You're never going to find that inside of your nephron. If you do find that in your nephron, it'll end up in your bladder and then you'll start to pee blood. And we get very concerned if that's happening. It means there's some sort of kidney disorder, infection, or disease. You should never, ever have blood inside of your urinary system. It should always be external to that system. Now, here's a little table of various things that are filtered, excreted, and then how much is reabsorbed. And there's some interesting numbers here. Water is not really that interesting, except for the fact that you filter about 180 liters per day. So we end up peeing out maybe 1% of that, which means that 99% of the water in our body is reabsorbed. Those million nephrons are filtering your body every moment. Even as you're sitting here watching this, 99% of the water in your body system is reabsorbed. This is assuming you fill your body with 100% water or 100% of the water you need. There are at times going to be situations where you drink more water than you need. So you have, say, a 101, 102% of the water that you actually need, in which case you're going to pee that extra as well. Also, 102 is a bit of an exaggeration. You probably can't get that much water in, but I don't know, say a really, really hot day, you might get 100.5 or 101% of your body fluids, in which case you'll just pee extra fluids if necessary. But at max, you'll excrete about 1.8 liters. Then you'll feel dehydrated. You'll have to get some water. So reabsorbing water, that kind of makes sense. We are water organisms after all. The sodium one's kind of weird though. You go through a large portion, that's 630 grams, but that's not as important. What's really crazy is that almost all of it gets reabsorbed in your body. Why do we as humans who consume so much sodium also reabsorb and keep that sodium in our bodies? There's got to be a reason for that. And there is, which we're going to see in a little bit. But that's kind of crazy. That means every single food that you eat here in North America, there's too much sodium. There's too much sodium that's coming into your body. It's building up. It's increasing your salt concentrations. We don't need it at all, but we always have too much of it. And if you don't think that's crazy, look at glucose. Every single bit of that glucose is going to be reabsorbed. And this kind of makes sense because this is the precursor to the energy source. Our body likes to have energy, that's its currency system. Glucose is its way to activate that energy system. It's like if I gave you $100, it doesn't make sense for you to just throw that $100 away. Or if I gave you $100 and you spent $90, it doesn't make sense for you to throw that leftover $10 into the garbage. Your body feels the same way about glucose. It is going to reabsorb every last drop of glucose. If you have any excess glucose, it'll just convert it into fat and it'll keep that because it's such a good energy source for the body. So you have to be careful with glucose because if you do consume more than that 100%, it is going to get converted into fat and that will be stored on your body. The only way that you can reduce that number is by exercising and burning that off, but that goes into your diet a little bit more than just the glucose itself. The piece that we would kind of associate with the urinary system is the urea down at the bottom here, but you can see only about half of it is reabsorbed. The rest of it is obviously peed out, but it means that our body has some use for that urea when it's still inside of our body. All right, so let's take a look at urine formation. Now, where do we get this pee from and how does it actually become urine? First off, we start off at the glomerulus, and we're going to have some of these substances crossing over into the Bowman's capsule. These are not going to contain blood. These are not going to contain the blood plasma also. Most of this is going to be reabsorbed in the PCT through the microvilli. So anything that we can use is going to be reabsorbed by the PCT. Now, interestingly, our body is going to do both active and passive transport. Active is spending money on transporting something up the concentration gradient. Passively is moving down the concentration gradient. So the example we used before was the waterfall example. Water always flows down the waterfall, so you should always absorb down the concentration gradient. In this case, sodium, our body for some reason spends energy to bring sodium up the concentration gradient. And think about it. If you had to climb up a waterfall, that would take a lot of energy. So our body is using a lot of its resources to retain this sodium for some reason. There has to be a reason for it, but it is going to retain some of that sodium. And the answer actually lies in the other reabsorptions here. Think about it, if your body reabsorbs sodium, that increases your overall body salt concentration. If your salt concentration increases, that increases the likelihood of water also being reabsorbed by osmosis. And water is seen as the more important commodity here. So we use energy to keep sodium so that we can retain more water. That's the whole purpose of retaining that sodium. And we'll see what that process is in a little bit also. Now, just so you have an idea of what is kept into your body, obviously reabsorb water, nutrients, and salts. You aren't going to get some of that water, that 1% gets peed out. All your nitrogenous wastes are going to go. Any excess salt is going to go also. Also, don't forget about the amino acids. When you eat proteins, we break them into those amino acid building blocks. We do not store those. So if you have protein in your body that doesn't get used, it ends up being peed out with your urine. Also, that falls into this nitrogenous waste section. There's a couple more waste products that we can see. Sorry, I skipped a couple of animations there. There's creatine that's in your body that helps your cells reabsorb some extra water. Sorry, I keep saying reabsorb. This helps your cells absorb more water. It gets converted to creatinine, which is then filtered and then removed from your body. So your urine is just going to contain anything that has not been reabsorbed or anything that has actively been secreted, things that our body doesn't want in its network. Another image of your nephron, if you wanted a more clean image of what this looks like, you can actually see in the Bowman's capsule what's being brought in. That includes water, urea, uric acid. Those crystals are really nasty, so you don't want too many of those. Glucose, amino acids, and salts. And then if we take a peek down at the bottom here, you can see in the collecting duct, water, salts, urea, uric acid. Ammonia is there, and creatinine is going to be here as well. So all of those are going to be removed from the body, from your bladder through micturition. What your kidney's going to do to look after your body, one of the main ones are its ability to manipulate those concentration balances. In particular, we want to reabsorb water, and your body's going to do so doing three different processes. First off, it's going to reabsorb salt. That's that whole sodium thing we were talking about. Then it's going to establish a solute gradient using that salt. Once you have the solute gradient, then you can reabsorb water, which will happen through osmosis down its own gradient. So solute up the concentration gradient, water down the concentration gradient. There's two parts to that though, and we're going to try understanding every single one of those. Starting off with the reabsorption of salt. Most of the sodium in your body is going to be reabsorbed. 2/3 from your PCT, a quarter from your DCT, or sorry, a quarter from your loop of Henle, and the last little 8% through your DCT. It's going to do so using a couple of hormonal regulations or hormonal regulators. Starting off, aldosterone, which is released from your adrenal glands, is going to promote, so it's going to encourage your body to lose potassium and reabsorb sodium. So think about it. It's getting your nephrons to release that potassium. You're going to pee the potassium out, and then you are going to reabsorb actively that sodium. This is all because of aldosterone. So your solute concentration is going down in your nephrons, it's going up in your body cells. Okay, so you've created a significant concentration gradient, not just by absorbing sodium, but also by ejecting and eliminating potassium. This is going to create this strong concentration gradient, and then we're going to have an additional hormone secreted called renin into what's called your juxtaglomerular apparatus. This is a connection between an afferent arteriole and your DCT. So your nephron actually folds in on itself, but can't really see that in our depictions. This is going to allow you to secrete renin, and that's going to work against low blood pressure. Renin activates a separate hormone called angiotensinogen. And angiotensinogen is a very exciting compound because it gets activated and turns into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 gets converted into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is going to cause your blood cells to vasoconstrict. It's going to tighten in. That is going to trigger the aldosterone release. That's going to increase your blood pressure and your blood volume because now water is going to also come into your blood to counteract that extra sodium that's inside of your body. So, this is why when you eat too much salt, your blood pressure goes up or your heart rate goes up because your blood vessels are actually constricting on each other because of this renin angiotensin mechanism. Now, if you're seeing this, you're seeing it's a chain reaction, and what actually stops this from happening? And we're going to see that in just a moment here. I just want to show you what the juxtaglomerular apparatus looks like. Here you can see the afferent arteriole. So this is connecting into the glomerulus to start. And the DCT, it loops back around and connects to, it doesn't connect, but it touches the afferent arteriole. And this region here between the cells is called your juxtaglomerular apparatus. And that's going to detect that pressure change and release that renin into that bloodstream. Okay, so let's take a peek here then at how your body's going to respond to that higher blood pressure. And it's actually your heart that has to deal with it. It makes sense. If your blood pressure goes up, your heart's going to freak out and be like, hey, why are you making me do all this work? And so it's going to release a separate hormone called ANH, which is the atrial natriuretic hormone. This is also going to work with sodium. It's going to be released from the right atrium of your heart, and it responds to that increased stretch that it has to do. This means that your blood volume has increased and it's going to release or it's going to secrete the ANH, which stops renin from being released by your juxtaglomerular apparatus. If renin stops secreting, it means that aldosterone can't release. And if aldosterone can't release, then sodium cannot be reabsorbed. And if sodium cannot be reabsorbed, then water can also not be reabsorbed. This causes you to excrete and pee out that extra salt. And we call that excretion natriuresis. Um, think about this for a second. It's a very complicated sounding system, but it's a cycle. A lot of steps to the cycle, but it's still a cycle that we can follow. And if we can understand and follow the cycle, we can understand how the hormones work. Pick any part to start with. I'm going to start with renin. Renin is secreted into your juxtaglomerular apparatus. This is going to trigger the release of aldosterone. So renin gets into your bloodstream from the juxtaglomerular apparatus to the afferent arteriole. It gets into your adrenal glands. It releases aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to increase the rate of that sodium being reabsorbed by also releasing angiotensinogen, which is converted into angiotensin 1, which is converted into angiotensin 2. And now we have that salt being reabsorbed, sodium into the body, potassium out, which forces water into your bloodstream, increasing your blood pressure, your blood volume. Your heart is like, nah, that's not okay. ANH is released. ANH comes into your body. ANH eventually gets back to your kidneys. It is going to inhibit that renin from being secreted. If renin can't be secreted, then everything else falls apart. And then we end up getting excretion natriuresis. They pee out extra salts. When we talk about the solute gradient, we're talking about the loop of Henle. This has got two different parts, the descending and the ascending limb. Salt is going to diffuse out of the lower part of the ascending limb. So at the very bottom of the dip, you're going to lose that salt, which means once you're at the upper part, you're going to have to go through active transport to get that salt out. What this does is it creates a very high solute concentration in the medulla of the kidney. So the inside of your kidneys are extremely salty. That's where all the sodium is. Urea is also going to increase the concentration of that high solute because urea is kept by the collecting duct and dumped into the renal pelvis. So it's all in the medulla section. This means that we're going to have water come in to balance out that solid or that solute balance. Otherwise, you have too much salt. That's going to crystallize and you're going to end up with gout. So your water does have to get into that system. It promotes the osmotic pressure so that you can transfer that water in. Lastly, the water has to get back into your body somehow. So water leaves your DCT because of that gradient. It's also going to leave the descending loop of the loop of Henle. That's just because of that change in the concentration. Okay, so you end up getting this really, really high concentration, this high osmotic gradient, and that forces that water to come and enter your body this way. As mentioned, we talked about a couple of various hormones, which are also going to help with the salt water balance. We also have hormones that are going to affect how our blood water volume is going to work. So we've got this posterior pituitary gland, so in the back of your brain, which is going to release ADH. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. This has nothing to do with ADHD. ADHD is a completely separate condition. This is a hormone called ADH. This increases the permeability of your collecting duct with water, and that's going to cause your body to reabsorb more of that water. If you're able to block ADH from functioning, that's what's going to cause your body to pee too much. So if ADH gets shut off, then you end up having more water getting dumped into your collecting duct, and you end up peeing more, and that causes a high volume of urine, but also a high volume of dilute because you have lots of water in there. You're going to need some sort of diuretic to cause this. You need a diuretic to counteract the ADH. That's something we're going to talk about in our last section, though. We're going to end off today, though, just looking at this image of the nephron. So the glomerulus would be in this Bowman's capsule. There's your PCT, the outer medulla to the inner medulla. Here in the descending limb, you can see where the water is reabsorbed into this inner medulla region. That increases the salt concentration a little bit inside of the loop. In the ascending limb, now the salt can be absorbed actively into your medulla. So now you have a high salt concentration in this area where my mouse is. You end up in the DCT collecting duct. Collecting duct now has to dump water here to balance out this this salt concentration. Otherwise, you have to have too salty of a salt concentration. You get these crystals forming in here. You have gout, or even worse, you end up with kidney stones. So something that you don't want to run into. And that is going to bring us. Oops, I moved my picture there. That is going to bring us to our third section. And our third section is where we're going to continue with the regulatory function, but we're going to talk about the diuretics, so how they're going to influence the way that our body reabsorbs and loses some of that water. For the time being, though, we're going to pause here. I'm going to close off this video, and I'll see you again to start off with diuretics in the last section of the urinary notes.